better roads and sustainable roads are not competing goals, but they do require a shift in how success is being defined. If there's an option using low carbon pavement materials or improving certain drainage or heat resilient system, design or solution, they usually cost more initially, if I'm correct, right? But they deliver lower emissions over time and they fewer failures, system failures over 30 to 40 years. If life cycle carbon long-term performance become mandatory criteria in project appraisals, designs change immediately. Whenever we talk about AI, we put like these stock images of like crazy lights and very fancy. But I actually think I actually see them as very operational decisions.
Hello, you're listening to Sustainable Infrastructure, an ORIS podcast where engineers, policymakers, and construction leaders share their experience on how the world can build sustainable infrastructure fit for the environmental and social challenge for the 21st century. I'm Nicolas Miravalls, co-founder and CEO of ORIS Materials Intelligence. Our guest today is Alice Yu, who is head of advocacy and outreach at the International Road Federation. Alice has spent over a decade at the forefront of global climate action in the transport sector, representing transport at UN Climate Summit and now mobilizing the global road community at IRF, the International Road Federation, headquartered in Geneva, across 5 continents. So today we're going to explore with Alice how does the international community and leaders see decarbonization in the transport sector and its infrastructure? How do you mobilize an industry organization with members around the world on a shared understanding of sustainability topics? What role do roads play in achieving sustainability goals? And as we enter in the UN Decade on Sustainable Transport in 2026, what does this mean for road infrastructure professionals on the ground? Alice, welcome to Sustainable Infrastructure. So first of all, maybe...
Hey, Nicola.
Hi, Alice. Hi, really good to have you here. After this short intro, maybe you tell us briefly about yourself and maybe in one sentence, why are you personally committed to making transport infrastructure more sustainable?
Well, thank you, first of all, Nicola, for inviting me to this podcast. I really appreciate it. You did a great, you did a great job summarizing who I am. I'm just gonna say I am a sustainable transport advocate. Just like what you've said, I've been leading advocacy and outreach work in the sustainable transport community for more than a decade now. And with IRF, we work with a wide range of stakeholders from across the road sector, and we provide practical knowledge. We provide access to policy engagement and also capacity building to support countries and industry leaders to deliver road systems that are inclusive, safe, green, and efficient. You asked me about why am I personally committed to make transport infrastructure more sustainable, right? It's so hard to do it in one sentence, but I'm going to give it a try. I think roads just quietly shapes almost every part of our daily lives, from getting my children to school to keeping our economies running. Yet most of them were designed from very different world decades ago. So working on sustainable road infrastructure matters to me because improving what already exists can unlock enormous socio-economic and environmental benefits without reinventing the system. I feel like that's not one sentence.
I'm sure we'll get back to this. Absolutely, because that leads me to the next question, because the UN has declared 26 as the start of the UN Decade for Sustainable Transport. And this is an important moment now. What is the one trend that you want to every professional have in mind about sustainable roads with this UN Decade starting?
Yeah. First of all, I think the UN Decade really comes at a very opportunistic time because I mean, last year was the 10th year anniversary from the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement, right? And we're at a point where global commitments are really under huge pressure to be delivered. We see it on the news. Geopolitical tensions are rising. The budgets for environmental and sustainability agendas, the programs are getting cut to the bones. So some governments are stepping back from climate and sustainability agendas and international cooperation at large. But the reality is that roads don't disappear when politics change. The emissions, the congestion, the safety risks, and the inequalities, they're baked into our road systems, and they just keep accumulating regardless of who's in power. So if there's one trend that I want every, infrastructure professional to understand, and that is that the costs of poorly designed roads, human and socioeconomic costs, they're enormous. Roads are already shaping almost every major global challenge that we care about, whether we acknowledge it or not. And there's some stats about it. We often say that there are about 1 billion people still live more than 2 kilometers away from an all-season road, which means that they have so limited access to jobs, schools, and healthcare. We often talk about how in cities, cars and trucks, they occupy a significant majority of road space, which means that low-income commuters, they rely heavily on walking, cycling, and public transport. They don't really actually get a fair share of space in cities. We also often talk about 1.19 million people are killed on roads every year, with millions of people being injured. And when it comes to road safety, behavior matters, but how roads are being designed and managed often determines whether a mistake becomes a fatal one or not, right? And there are stats about air pollution, and there's stats about road infrastructure exposed to at least more than a quarter of the roads and railway infrastructure around the world is exposed to one natural hazard every year. So the amount of money that is being accumulated to make sure that these infrastructure keeps running when a disaster hits is enormous. And some studies estimate that it goes up to $22 billion every year. And so these are huge costs. And I think the UN decade matters because roads are very long-lived assets. And most of what we will be living with by 2035, it's already built right now. So I think right now it's the time to really think carefully about how we can make them safer, make them more inclusive and more resilient. Otherwise, we just keep paying the price for road systems that fall short of their purposes.
Absolutely. And I'm also very happy to see the UN system taking at large a comprehensive approach to road. And you said it all. I mean, it's about safety, it's about resilience, it's about climate impact, it's about social impact and socioeconomic indicators. At the end of the day, it is really complex and comprehensive. And we need a hat to understand all that. So this is great. Alice, I suggest we get through the few pillars of this interview, starting with
Sure.
the international coordination and industry organization. We
Mhm.
we are in front of a large topic, and let's start with the big picture. You have worked for within both SLOCAT, which is a multi-stakeholder partnership, and now IRF, the International Road Federation, a global road industry organization in Geneva. What vision does the international community actually have on sustainable transport, and what levers do they identify?
I think the easiest way to find like the latest and shared consensus of sustainable transport vision would not be coming from a single organization, even with something like SLOCAT or IRF. But the UN Decade, it's there and it was launched a month ago, and there's an implementation plan that came out of it, and it's online on the official website, and anyone can Google about it. I think it's fairly practical considering the immensely wide spectrum of transport interventions that we have to tackle, right? And it does reflect years of knowledge and expertise and dialogues among countries and organizations like RF and SLOCAT and many others in that wider sustainable transport landscape. And if anybody reads it, I think at the heart of that vision, I think the international community is agreeing on one thing, that transport is not just about moving vehicles, it's about shaping opportunities. The way that roads or railways, ports, or public transport, they're planned, it determines who can reach jobs or schools or healthcare or markets, or who is kept safe or who's left behind, right? It also determines whether countries lock themselves into high emissions and rising costs, or building systems that are resilient and affordable over the long term. So I think the vision at the core of his heart is to rebalance transport systems. And if anybody reads the implementation plan, I think then we can see the levers quite clearly. I think one major lever that we're seeing is that who transport is designed for. Right. So today, many systems work really well for cars and vehicles, but poorly for pedestrians, public transport users, or rural communities, women, low income groups. And so the decade pushes countries to redesign transport to access and safety as the starting point, not the afterthoughts of their transport systems. Um, Another levers that we're seeing is how risks are being managed. So we're talking about road deaths here. We're talking about climate damages, supply chains, disruptions. They're no longer seen as unavoidable side events. It's clear that safer road design, resilient infrastructure, or better maintenance, they can dramatically reduce human and economic losses if they are treated as core investments rather than optional upgrades. And a third lever that I could think of is how growth is being supported. So transport is expected to deliver trade, to logistics, to regional integration, but with far less waste. And that's such a hard thing to do. But that just means smoother borders, better connected corridors, smarter use of data and digital tools to cut delays, to cut costs and emissions all at the same time. There's an element about urban and cities as well. So it's because we are living in a world where people are growing into urbanized world. So instead of designing urban space around cars, the vision is for cities that are walkable, that are cyclable, that are public transport that is easiest and safest options, and where mobility supports livable neighborhoods rather than congestions and urban sprawl. There's an element of technology and data as well, but they're not the silver bullets. I think it's quite clear that we need to understand that they're here to help to understand travel behavior or understand where infrastructure needs to come into a better shape. There's an element of institutional and skills as well, and that's what RF and many of our colleagues are here for. We provide that capacity or that financing capacity or coordination in order to facilitate these decisions. So yeah, I would say the plan does give a pretty good summary of that vision that we have been discussing for many years now.
That's amazing how we touch everything, whatever the angle we take, and that's the road
Yes.
system. I mean, road system is just, as you said, it's just everywhere. And I
Mhm.
want to recall also the sustainability definition here, huh, where sustainability is at the same time financial, environmental, and social. Those three pillars are just
Yes.
everywhere in the transport system. And that's what
Mhm.
makes it fascinating, and that what makes it complicated as well. So
Yes.
then, when you're trying to mobilize an industry organization around sustainability topics, what do you think are the biggest challenges? And you probably have countries at different stages of development and with different priorities. So how do you tackle those variances?
I think you're really addressing the core of the issue because indeed, when we talk about sustainable transport development, all countries are going to tell you different stories, right? Because they're at very different stages of development, of budget availability, of their political cycle, very different day-to-day realities. In many developing countries, the conversations could be still around basic assets and safety, right? So making sure that roads is passable year round. That's all they need to, that's the first thing that they need to tackle. Buses that can reach neighborhoods safely, or children that can cross the road without risking their lives. So the reality for them is reliability and dignity. So it's less about the high tech solutions or the AI and everything. But at the same time, the higher income countries, indeed, they're grappling with a much more complex set of solutions. They're talking about electrification, how to integrate them into road networks, how to generate renewable energy from road infrastructure, how to manage automated and connected mobility, AI tools, data issues, and privacy issues. I even said in the presentations before talking about flying cars recently. So it's within the same organization that we mobilize, and you might have one member asking how to design a safer two-lane roads, another one talking about AI traffic management. So I think then what leads to another challenge is capacity. The differences in capacity, right? Because we often see advanced technologies promoted globally, right? These are the best practices. These are the silver bullets that we need to follow. But in practice, a lot of road agencies, especially from developing countries, they don't have the skills, the knowledge, or the institutional setup to operate them. And so even though if they have a new tools or system being installed, but if they don't have the trained staff or maintenance budget, it will never deliver the promised benefits that this practice was envisioned to have. Then there's this competing priorities and time horizons as well, because you're going to have some members that are under the time pressure to deliver reduced fatalities over the next year, or something that is more politically visible that they need to show. And there's some other people that are working on more long-term solutions, like Oris, and you're focusing on that next 15 to 20-year sustainability outcomes. So sustainability often asks decision makers to kind of balance that short-term needs with long-term outcomes, which isn't always so easy in real life politics and budget cycles. So I think what really brings us together in such a diverse group is how we reframe sustainability as a very practical problem solving and not a philosophy, because people still come to me saying that sustainability feels very philosophical. But if we could really link to very specific matrices like fewer deaths, lower maintenance costs, more reliable roads and schedule for services, less congestion and travel time, then it becomes much more relevant and more down to earth when you're managing, a basic road network. So yeah, I think the challenge isn't the lack of agreement on where we're going, but just how to design a pathway that actually recognize these different realities and respect these realities and capacity, and understanding that yes, people do, or countries do progress at different speeds and different scales.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the challenge between short term and long term, which is
Yeah.
every day on our table as professionals. But I want also to get your views about the challenges between action, direct action, and policies, because you work in the field of policies, and we've seen, for example, the celebration of the 10th anniversary of the Paris Agreement last year. I'm
Yeah.
interested to understand from you how those agreements, international policy directions, influence the day-to-day adoption, and what is the chain from those scope into actual project or country starting into sustainability. What's your experience in that?
It's a question that I ask myself a lot of times too, because I mean, UN talks, climate negotiations, they feel very far and they feel very removed sometimes from what's actually happening on the ground. So definitely, I think that's a question that I also ask myself, and I'm sure a lot of my colleagues are also asking too. I think the short answer is that global agreements don't build roads, but they change the rules that roads are built under. Because we're talking about, you were mentioning about COP. So if we look at the Paris Agreement, of course, what it does is establishing a shared direction, right? Just like the UN Decade, and countries committed to long-term decarbonization and resilience and and they have different pledges and goals and outcomes every year. But I think one thing that was very, very practical to kind of link that policy to practices is through the nationally determined contributions, or what they call NDCs. And these are national reportings that countries are mandated to submit to the UNFCCC process. And that includes targets economy-wide and sector-specific for emissions reductions, supported by measures and actions that they are committed to deliver in order to reach these targets. And there have been a wide range of studies and analysis on how NDCs, or how transport has been reflected in NDCs over the years. But the NDCs are the first step in the chain, because once transport starts appearing in NDCs, which it didn't before until, I mean, it's really growing and it's growing to a very nice trend. But when it starts appearing in reportings like NDCs, it starts showing up in national climate strategies and adaptation plans, then it stops being a side issue and it becomes a policy responsibility. So then you're having the Ministry of Climate, the Ministry of Transport, and Finance and Planning, they're suddenly expected to show how roads and transport contribute to emissions reduction, to safety and resilience and other matrices. The second step is how these changes investment decisions, and that's a very important priorities over the last couple of years of COP. So climate negotiations and commitments, they increasingly shape the conditions under which money flows. Then you have the MDBs, the climate funds that are being set up, and the bilateral donors. They now ask whether a road project aligns with climate targets, or the goals and the social outcomes that are aligned with the agreement. And that would affect the project cycle and the project appraisals, the design and the standards, and even when a project gets funding finance at all. Then it comes to the third and often the most underestimated step, which is the standards, the guides, and the capacity. And that's where organizations like RF and other platforms, they play a very important role, because the global commitments, they create a lot of questions. Practitioners, they ask very practical questions. What does the climate resilient road actually look like? What does that mean to reduce emission over the road's lifetime? How wide is the road? That's their day-to-day question. And now they're asking much more deeper questions around these topics. So by the time you get to an actual project, these influences are very layered. The project reflects national climate commitments. It responds to those financing criteria shaped by the climate goals. And then it follows those updated standards and guidelines influenced by the processes.
Absolutely. And this is where IRF can play a role also in making those policies and those commitments land into practical actions. And I recognize your work in that field, very, very important. Specifically on IRF now and the roadmaps that you have for change. The UN decade that we mentioned earlier is absolutely important, but the IRF commitment to this UN decade is as important, I would say, because this is really the translation to our sector, and who better than the IRF to carry this UN decade on the field, on the ground. Oris is a proud supporter of this commitment, by the way. And this commitment is shaped around 4 thematics, which are inclusion, safety, sustainability, and efficiency for roads. Can you walk us through what those roadmaps actually are, and how they'll drive change for the sector?
First of all, thank you to you, because without Oris's support, we never want to do a commitment that's by ourselves. That's the start, because we are an ecosystem of stakeholders. So I think Oris was one of the earliest partners to really jump onto our question of who wants to be part of us. But I think these kind of roadmaps that we're committed to deliver, they're really about closing the gap that we have just talked about, between ambition of these kind of global agreements and delivery of practices. So when we make this commitment under the UN decade, we were very deliberate about what these roadmaps should or shouldn't be. We don't want them to be high-level vision papers or another manifesto. And we also don't want them to be like a one-size-fit-all kind of prescriptive, checklist. They're meant to be practical navigation tools that kind of give a wide range of suggestions for road agencies and decision makers. So each of these roadmaps will focus on one outcome that we know roads must deliver better over the next 10 years. And you just mentioned it. It's inclusion, it's safety, it's green, which covers decarbonization and resilience, and it's efficiency. But instead of treating these as silos, the roadmaps show how these goals reinforce with each other in real projects. So taking the example of inclusive roads, the roadmap will look at how roads can expand opportunities rather than reinforce inequality, right? So we're talking about safe rural access, better connection to essential services, education, and jobs. And instead of only talking about rural access, we also talk about urban access. So in cities, what are the steps to rebalance urban space that actually works for people who rely on them most? We have a roadmap on safer roads that builds on the UN Decade of Action for Road Safety, which have existed for a while now. But from an infrastructure perspective, so it will focus on how safety gets embedded into planning, into design, to construction, maintenance, and operations. So safety isn't just dependent on behavior, but it's designed into the system itself. We have a roadmap for green roads, and that is about the full life of a road. So it's not just emissions from construction materials, but also how roads enable or discourage emissions over decades, and how roads can withstand climate impacts, how they interact with nature. We bring together decarbonization, resilience, and also biodiversity or nature-based concerns. The last roadmap for efficient and safe and smart roads look at how far we can get the most value out of what we already have, basically. So maximizing and optimizing road systems, looking at digitalization, intelligent operations, better asset management, smarter procurement as well. And we break them down into levers that road agencies can actually pull. So we will provide some sort of design choices or operational practices, technology options, some sort of key policy and regulatory shifts that needs to happen, and the financing and procurement tools, and most importantly, also institutional capacity. And hopefully we will also develop some self-checks and some checklists so that they can ask themselves, where are we today now, and what are the realistic steps for us in the next process. And I think lastly, it's very important to remember that these roadmaps are living tools. So because we're talking about 10 years, right? So like what we're writing today might not be relevant in just 5 years. So we need to constantly, as a group, we work on it together and we see where we're at, and we adapt it for our training purposes and programs.
It's great to have working groups around those to make them live
Yes.
and evolve for sure. Maybe refocusing on green roads, as you just pointed it, the whole life carbon management, for example, or sustainable materials or resilience, all those topics from a policy perspective, where do you see the biggest barriers to implement them and make sure that the roads become really an holistic system where we just understand and carefully drive all those indicators together? Road typically comes from historically from pure mechanical perspective. We wanted to have carriageways for loads and people, and I'm sad to say that's it. But now we have more and more on our table. It becomes more and more complex, and we need more indicators, we need more parameters, we need more drivers. So where is for you the biggest barrier? And is it the lack of standard? Is it about the procurement? Is it about financing? Something else? What's your view about that?
I feel like we could easily write an essay about this.
I think we should.
For me, I think it's yeah. Yes, we should. We probably should. Let's write it down. Um, if I could pin it down, I think the first is how projects are being evaluated, right? Because most road investments are still appraised using frameworks that prioritize upfront capital costs or traffic performance or how fast they can be constructed. So then other metrics like whole life carbon emissions or climate resilience or long-term maintenance, they're often included, but maybe it just has narrative considerations, but they don't really carry enough weight to change the design outcomes. For example, what I could think of is, if there's an option using low carbon pavement materials or improving certain drainage or heat resilient system design or solution, they usually cost more initially, if I'm correct, right? But they deliver lower emissions over time and they fewer system failures over 30 to 40 years. In a lot of appraisal systems, these long-term benefits are either discounted heavily or they are treated as non-monetary. So the greener options lose before the projects even reach procurement. Oh, and then it goes to procurement rules too, right? Because even when the project teams understand these benefits of greener designs, the procurement framework often locks them into the lowest cost compliance, right? I want the cheapest solutions here. So the tender documents may specify materials and methods based on outdated standards, or they don't really leave enough room for innovation. So I think as a result, contractors are not being rewarded for reducing emissions or improving the durability or even integrating natural-based solutions, right? So if these matrices are not explicitly scored in bids, then the contractors, they have no incentive to propose them. And they don't really care anymore. But I think perhaps on a more broader policy level is also like governance and accountability. So the responsibilities for emissions reduction, for adaptation or biodiversity protection, they are often split across ministries and agencies and units. So in practice, that means that these green requirements are treated as external constraints because it's not, perhaps it's not my mandate in my unit that I work in, rather than their core objectives. So you would have project teams that want to focus what they're directly accountable for, which is the delivery timelines and the capital cost, and all these other long-term performance will kind of fall between these institutional boundaries. I think that's very hard nut to crack, but that's what we're here for, right? We're trying to persuade policy and regulatory frameworks so that these components in the stages could make changes.
Yes.
And that facilitates and create more incentives.
Yeah. And I would add also maybe rather in terms of the conflict between costs and sustainability and solutions, somehow we can have good news here because at the difference of other sectors, in roads, often we find that sustainable roads and greener roads and long-term good behaviors roads are also might be also more interesting from a cost perspective because it's all related to materials and transport and quantities and volumes and so and we rather have a good tendency to go the same way, which is not very much known, I would say, from the sector. So it's worth exploring the solutions. It's worth looking for alternatives and have the procurement system and the policy system enable that, because most of the time the solutions are in front of us, but we don't use them because of the practice and it's easier sometimes also to copy paste the previous one and go for it.
Yes.
So yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
So let's keep the open mind also, and we find good solutions.
Yeah.
I want to hear you, Alice, about the capacity building programs that IRF is really driving. What do you think capacity building is for the countries, and how do you see the gap in terms of
Yeah.
capacity in countries, and how do you see IRF bridging that gap?
Um, I think when it comes to capacity building, because RF has been doing capacity building for many years already, and that's one of the major thing that we offer to our members. I think what we do see is that road authorities, they don't lack that political will per se. Like they generally know what they want. They want fewer deaths. They want more resilient roads. They want better performance. But the gap is that they don't know how to deliver, or they don't have enough knowledge or capacity to deliver, right? And so what we are seeing is a very, like, for example, in road safety, there are agencies that will endorse to the safe system approach, but they don't really have the enough personnel to run the network safety screening, or they to carry out the road safety audits with international standards, or to prioritize treatments using risk and cost effectiveness approaches. So then safety remains a policy objective rather than something that actually is embedded in their budget, in their design, and in their operations. And another example, for example, is climate resilience and asset management. Many authorities, they're already dealing with flooding. They're dealing with heat damages or premature pavement failures on a yearly basis, right? Because they experience these disasters very frequently, but they don't really have the tools to assess climate risks across their networks or to plan maintenance over a full life cycle. So the projects will get funded, but the assets deteriorate faster than expected because resilience and long-term performance were never fully embedded. So what we're trying to do here is that we come up with a program that address these very specific issues. So our capacity building program is what we call is technologically agnostic. So we're not here to like, hey, this is like the new commercial solution and you should endorse it or you should do it. But we're here to look at things more holistically in as if the whole life cycle, and we break it down into different stages of project management. And each one of them we could customize based on the national agency's needs, or they could also take it in person or online. So it's very flexible. And in a way that what we're trying to create is that it's not awareness, because what we wanted to do is what we just said, right? This last mile between policy and practice. What we wanted to make sure is that they have the right skills and tools and the institutional setup so that they can make these decisions by themselves. And I think that's what self-reliance, the principle of self-reliance comes in when RF delivers these capacity building program to the countries.
think this is the best transition to the IRF strategic drivers and policy influence. You've launched
Yes.
last year the IRF Vision 2030
Mhm.
strategy, which is organized around four drivers: the unity, knowledge, influence, and impact. What is the aim and objective of this strategy, which is really a turn into how IRF operates on the ground, huh, as I see it? Please let us know your views about that.
Um, Thank you. Thank you for bringing us to this, because the 2030 strategy isn't just written by the Secretariat, right? It's a collective effort that we have consultation with colleagues, including Nicola and colleagues from ORIS and others from our memberships, to collectively thinking what is the most pressing context that we need to tackle for the road sector, and what is RF's position and how do we best deliver based on the nature of who we are, which is a member-based organization. And the four drivers that you've just mentioned kind of really address all these issues that we were just discussing earlier. They're all fancy names, but unity, is about bringing the sector together. In very practical terms, it means convening the different stakeholders to platforms like the RF annual conference, in which next year we're organizing it in Geneva from the 16th to the 18th of November. We have ongoing webinars and peer exchanges called the Circle of Excellence. We also have joint initiatives like what we have under the UN Decade, so that people don't usually work together or actually in the same room, and that they can compare different approaches and they can learn from each other. There's the driver for knowledge. It's about making information useful. We have our most long-standing product, like the World Road Statistics, and our data warehouse and our Insight series. These are meant to kind of provide these evidence-based guidelines and insights for practitioners to better understand what are the latest trends and gaps and opportunities are within the road transport sector. And we also have influence, and that's where I come in, about advocacy, because we can't do advocacy without unity, where it's not just me talking about it, it's me with members and partners talking about why sustainable roads is important. And that's how we can shape the policy discussions around roads. It means engaging in UN processes. It means working with road agencies and development banks. It means contributing to standards and guidelines development, to making sure that road sector perspectives are reflected in these discussions. And then we have impacts. It's about delivery. We do have a number of projects and programs that are around these issues. And another important element is capacity building that we were just talking about. So trainings, peer learning, advisory support, and project level engagement also helps agencies to kind of strengthen their practices and to improve how roads are being planned, procured, and operated. So basically, I think the strategy isn't about redefining our mission, but it's kind of sharpening what we have already done, but kind of putting them in different squares and making sure that we're aligned towards one outcome, and that our members also understand what we're working for, and we do that over the long term.
Really see that the IRS strategy and the vision is really well aligned with this UN decade we talked about. And IRF is a place to regroup various players and professionals from different perspectives and from different horizons. We have, you have public authorities, engineers, designers, startups, large companies, smaller ones, etc. So it's really a wide and diverse and rich group of skills and competencies. How do you navigate the potential differences between members, and how do you manage to prioritize your roadmap and the common roadmap across this diversity of members?
I think you're very right, and these are differences. As Wolfgang mentioned, countries to implement sustainable transport policies, they already exist in differences. And then there's the members that operate in these different countries and in these different sectors and these different practices. I think the most important way to kind of resolve these differences or align ourselves is it's to understand what we mean by good road. Because for the longest time, I think there are road organizations, they do implicitly treat private cars and vehicles throughput as their primary measure of success, right? The wider the roads, or the higher the speed or more capacity, the better. And that's their clientele, and that's how they get benefits and profits from. And so from that perspective, people first or sustainability approaches, could feel like a challenge to their established business models and professional norms. But our role here is to kind of reframe that conversation, because if there's one thing that we've learned, is that better roads and sustainable roads are not competing goals, but they do require a shift in how success is being defined. So a better road is not just one that moves the vehicle faster, more. It's about reducing fatalities. It's about lasting longer under climate stress. It's about supporting access for different users. And it's about delivering values over its full life. And so when you look at roads in these lenses, then it makes sense, right, to have performance criteria based on sustainability. And so it's not easy, but at the same time, I think our membership are really really supported with these priorities already, and consensus building within such a diverse membership will need to start with acknowledging the realities, but then really telling them that we need to carefully assess what success is about for you. And from there, it's very easy to find a common ground. And it actually is easier than we think it is. And that our members are so supportive to our initiatives, and that in eventually, I think we're and the 2030 strategy that we just mentioned also becomes a very good platform for us to kind of start a conversation.
Pointed that execution here and landing from policy and strategy to implementation, and you know that this is a topic which is
Yes.
important to us as well.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about technology, digital data, AI, and all those driving forces that we have on our table today. How do you see new technologies today changing the infrastructure sector, which is historically quite traditional, to say the least, but we see a rapid turn now. How do you see this changing us, and the adoption rate, and the different opportunities that this is opening?
I I think these solutions and technologies, they're really helping to make things visible and measurable that was previously managed by, surveys, like very human approaches with mistakes. Uh, for example, traffic operations, right? We got the sensors, the cameras now, and the AI-based analytics. They really let road operators to see congestion and to foresee incidents and near misses in real time. Um, so instead of responding after a crash or a breakdown, operators can adjust speed, manage the lanes, or to reroute traffic very dynamically and very fast. And that really directly improves safety and reduces stop and go traffic, which cuts emissions without building new capacity. I think in road safety, we see that a lot. AI-driven video analytics. We hear a lot of these solutions. They can now really identify risky behavior and these conflict points, even when the crash data is incomplete or unreliable. They really create a much more complete scenarios where operators can rely on. And that really helps to prioritize low cost safety improvements, because then you're much more targeted at very specific intersections or corridors rather than applying very generic solutions. Um, I think it's important to know that these tools don't change the sector by becoming very futuristic. Even whenever we talk about AI, we put like these stock images of like crazy lights and very fancy. But I actually see them as very operational decisions. They really support operational decisions faster and more holistically. And when it do that, transport systems will become more preventive rather than reactive. And that's, I would say, it's most relevant for sustainability outcomes.
What is good as well is that the sector is probably transforming from inside. So we
Yes.
rarely see new technologies coming from the sky into the roads. So we are really industry driven, and that's reassuring with the direction it's taking. But as you said, it's very it's very transformative, and there are lots of solutions already existing, and the question is about implementation and adoption. I could have this conversation going for the day, but I guess we have to stop somewhere. So I'm really
I enjoy it so much, Nicolas.
I'm really
I agree. It's a
yeah.
good thing. This really could be 3 hours. You're right.
Absolutely.
Or a full essay.
I think we will have appointment for the next round also. Maybe before we close, a few minutes, and maybe quick what we call the rapid fires questions.
Okay.
If you have to choose one concrete change for the next 12 months to accelerate decarbonization, what would it be?
Change how road projects are being approved and evaluated. if life cycle carbon long-term performance become mandatory criteria in project appraisals, designs change immediately. We don't need new technologies for that, right? I think the technologies are there, just the different rules that will get it funded, and that changes things dramatically.
Great, great. Another one. What's one practice or technology that you've seen work brilliantly in one region that deserves a wider adoption globally?
I think I might be a bit biased here because I'm Asian, so I'm going to say something that works very well in my part of the world. But I have recently sat in a lot of conversations about digital traffic management in Asia, to get more out of existing roads rather than expanding them. So there are examples from Hong Kong and from Singapore and parts of East Asia where they really don't build more new roads, but they focus on real-time traffic control, incident detection, speed management. They have drastically reduced congestion and emissions without adding new lanes. And it's a very important reminder that smarter operations can deliver things much faster than building new roads. So I would go for that.
Follow your advice. And last question. If someone listening to this podcast would like to change its organization, whether it's a road agency, a contractor, or material supplier, and engineers, what, in your opinion, should they do first towards sustainability?
I'm going to change my answer to what they shouldn't do first. I think the first step is that they shouldn't do it alone, if that makes any sense. I think sustainable road infrastructure isn't something any agency or contractor or supplier can figure out in isolation. The fastest way to move is to learn from peers who are already dealing with the same trade-offs, similar regulatory, constraints and budgetary constraints. And that's why joining a community like IRF matters, because it does give you that access to shared experiences, to the evidence, to the practical guidelines, and honest conversations about what works and what doesn't work. And I do think that transformation starts by connecting your day-to-day decisions to a wider ecosystem that is already working on these questions and trying to tackle these questions, and learning how others are turning ambition into practices. So
Thank
join
you.
IRF.
Exactly. That's the first thing.
Self-promoting time.
That's the first thing to do is to join IRF. Then perfect. Loud and clear.
Thank you.
Alice, thank you so much. It's a great discussion we had, and I appreciate your views. Very, very insightful. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your experience. Thank you for sharing. And I guess we'll have to continue the discussion.
Yes, we do. I mean, the pleasure is very, very mutual. Thank you so much, Nicolas. And also getting to know you much better through these conversations. Thanks a lot.
Have a good day.
Maybe next time I'll get you to an IRF podcast. Let's do that.
Will be my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. See you soon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.